Welcome to my lecture recital entitled Songs of a People, a musical history of the Ashkenazi Jews, presented by me, Dirk Holzman, Baritone, and Andrew Stewart, Pianist. So, I want to dive straight in. We're going to start off with an example of Solomon Rossi's polyphony setting of Jewish texts, which originates from a collection of the earliest notated Jewish music. We're going to listen to a recording of his Hashkivenu, which is a prayer said during Mariv, or evening services, and it asks God to let us lie down in peace and safety at night. So, ultimately, how did we end up here? For one, Rossi's music sounds strikingly similar to other Renaissance polyphony, but ultimately, in what ways did Jewish music develop uniquely throughout its history? So, well, we sadly don't have any music remaining from the time of the Temple in Jerusalem. We do have documentation about its importance and how it might have been presented. Firstly, Jewish religious ceremonies were basically entirely different at this point. They featured a large orchestra and choir used in all of their public religious ceremonies. These contained strings, winds, both signaling, such as the shofar, and musical, percussion, chorus, 12 or more adult male singers, and boys of the Levites, the musician cast. And there was also mahol, or dance, which served an integral part in these religious ceremonies. But after the destruction of the first temple, the entire art of the instrumental music of the Levites disappeared. However, we likely have at least some idea of how Jewish music at this time might have sounded because of its relation to other music of that region. From Idelson's Jewish Music and its Historical Significance, Jewish music is the song of Judaism through the lips of the Jew. It is the tonal expression of Jewish life and development over a period of more than 2,000 years. All Oriental music, be it Semitic, Altaic, or Hindu, shares these basic characteristics. 1. It's modal. 2. It's ornamented. 3. It's unrhythmical. 4. Quarter tone tonality as opposed to the semitone tonality that we have in most Western music today. It features a lot of improvisation. It mostly lacks harmony. It's a folk-like character, and it has very simple form with short phrases. So, perhaps our best avenue into this early Jewish music is through trope. Albeit it has warped over the last few millennia, it gives us at least some indication of what music might have sounded like. Ta'amim, or the musical notation or trope of the Torah, featured similar scales to that of the Greeks, be it tetrachordal scales or musical scales built of 4 notes. These biblical modes were built with motives to communicate punctuation. The trope is really a reminder of motives. It was only meant to indicate small patterns without notes or exact intervals. Up on the screen, we have an example of trope from the Torah and how it was converted effectively into musical notation. This, of course, is a fairly rigid understanding of trope, and it likely was extremely fluid, which is why what we experience today in terms of trope is probably quite different than what they heard 2,000 years ago. So, the Jewish prayer modes. These were various modes that were used in the ancient Jewish services, and they were really built for different purposes, for each prayer and set of prayers related to a specific category or specific goal of the group. These were mostly derived from biblical modes, and they each had their own tetrachordal scale base. Some of the most significant ones were the tefillah, or prayer, Salicha, forgiveness, vidui, confession. This was traditionally, they used major to express truth. They never rose above the 5th or 6th scale degree when using this mode. And the one that's probably most commonly heard today, the Ahava Rabbah mode, which features 2 tetrachords, one which has the harmonic minor kind of sound to it, although that augmented second is found in that first tetrachord, whereas in a harmonic minor we hear it towards the latter half of the scale. And this was actually used quite significantly by the Eastern European Jews well beyond this point, and we'll get to that a bit later. It wasn't really a biblical mode, and was likely created and adopted by Jews, not really one that they had created themselves. But with the destruction of the first and second temples, the Jews dispersed throughout Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. The Eastern European and German Jews became the Ashkenazi, the Babylonian, Persian, Yemenite Jews became the Mizrahim, the Syrian, North African, Italian, and Spanish Jews, the Sephardim, and then there was also a smaller group of Jews in Ethiopia. Thus, after this point, we really see the Jewish music develop differently in each community due to its different outside influences. From this point forward, we're going to focus the lecture and this recital on the development of Ashkenazi and German Jewish music, although there is a wealth of beautiful music in the other traditions as well. So, stepping forward to 70 CE through 700 CE, we have the very beginning of the development of Ashkenazi Jewish music. Following the destruction of the temples, we see an end to most instrumental and secular music. At this point, only music with sacred text carries value. The rabbis banned secular music in most public music performance. All instrumental music, even religious, was prohibited as a sign of national mourning over the destruction of the temple. And similar to the church later on in history, we have a focus on simplicity in text and music. Jews were given quite a bit more creative freedom in their prayers, but not in the Torah. The Torah was meant to be read purely for instruction, so the tune had to be subordinate to the text. It couldn't distract the reader or the community from the words of the Torah. Prayers, however, were seen as an outpouring of the heart, and musical embellishments added a power of interpretation to these. There was some unison congregational singing, but it was largely pretty limited. At the end of this era, the Jews faced persecution, and really created no new poetry or music, unfortunately. This was a pretty common occurrence throughout the history of Jews, where they would settle, become comfortable, and only to find themselves forced out or killed. So, Cantor Yoni Rose, a friend and mentor of mine, who serves as the Chazan of the Frankfurt Jewish community, has a pretty extensive performance resume, both as a Chazan and as an opera singer. He was very kind and recorded several short videos in response to a few interview questions that I created for this program. And this will be the first example of one of those videos where he presents a general overview of the history of the Chazan.
Initially, the function of the Chazan, or cantor, in the synagogue was to chant the Torah. This was largely improvisational when Jews began publicly chanting the Torah in the synagogue about 2,500 years ago. But around the year 7 to 800 AD, a group of scholars in Tiberias standardized Torah chant, and therefore the improvisational nature and interpretive nature of the Chazan began to wane in Ashkenazi synagogues. But as time progressed, the prayers said in the synagogue continued to develop, at least the text and the liturgy, and along with that came a need for the musical way to express those prayers. Now, since the Ashkenazi Jews of Europe were living among different cultures, they also lived among different musical cultures. People living in France were mostly surrounded by French music, people in Germany by German music, and people in Eastern Europe by the music around them in Eastern Europe, among the Polish peasants, Polish and Russian peasants. And their interpretation of Jewish prayer texts were influenced by their specific life experiences that were specific to each of those places where they lived. So they began to borrow musical means of expression from the musical worlds around them. This is how they developed kind of uniquely from the way that Middle Eastern Jews developed their music. One, Middle Eastern Jews largely kept the interpretive and improvisational nature of Torah reading and Torah chanting. And two, of course, Middle Eastern Jews were surrounded by a musical fabric wholly different from the music surrounding European Jews. So, when you understand that cantorial music developed as part of a combination of Jewish tradition and the secular music tradition, or not just secular music tradition, but also non-Jewish religious music that they were hearing around them, you can understand how cantorial music has continued to develop and is influenced by the music around each specific culture now that we live in the 20th century, or 21st century now. But after the Jewish people started to leave Europe en masse, beginning in the late 19th century and continuing in earnest through the middle of the 20th century, their cantorial music began to be influenced by the music around them. It is now much more popular music in style, and the classical cantorial music has begun to fall out of favor in synagogues.
So, well, thank you, Yoni. And two, we covered a lot of spoilers for the rest of the presentation, although we're going to go into quite a bit more detail about the history of the chazan and its development. So, as we just heard, the chazan developed quite gradually and out of necessity, and Jewish music as a whole through this entire period henceforward, and before rather too, was largely influenced by the music around it. Focusing on the chazan, these independent communities really needed their own musical leaders. At first, this was done by a layman called a precentor, or shaliach tzibur, messenger of the community. These people memorized prayers, recited benedictions, improvised prayer melodies, read Torah. They had to be an upstanding member of community, but most importantly, they had to possess a sweet voice. Over time, though, the need for trained professionals to fill this role grew, and this became what was known as the chazanim. They drove music forward at this point and onwards. Also of note here, a bit unrelated, is that the Jewish model of the synagogue and the institution of the precentor was transplanted into the church by early Christians and served as a model for their development later on. And now we're going to start to look at the Eastern European Jews and the German Jews as somewhat separate groups, because they had quite different outside influence that led them to develop pretty differently throughout the next 1,000 years. So, I want to note that Jews adopted German folk and Christian sacred songs when they were in Germany. This German music heavily influenced the modes, reshaped them from their tetrachordal form to place a lot more emphasis on the third and fifth scale degrees, as we hear in Western music today. There were also the Mi Sinai melodies, which were leading motives or tunes that were used for a lot of the significant prayers. From Germany between the 11th and 15th centuries, this really resonated exclusively for the Ashkenazim, and they were only preserved by memory, so the original forms could really only be guessed at based upon Jewish music that was recorded starting in the 16th century. A very good example of this is the Kol Nidrei prayer, which we'll hear later on in the service, and you heard a month or two ago if you went to high holiday services and went to the Kol Nidrei services prior to Yom Kippur. I do want to note that many of the melodies used in Jewish services today are a bit wrongly called Mi Sinai melodies, when a lot of them are only actually 100 to 200 years old. So, musical creation with the German Jews stagnated around the 15th century, largely due to a desperate social position and oppression, Germanization as German culture and music flourished, and this repeated expulsion of Jews really disrupted synagogues, so there were few engaged permanent chazanim. Resultingly, the chazanim became minstrel-like, traveling throughout the region, and dedicated themselves to constructing dazzling tunes to win over audiences. There were really only chazanim in the synagogues in major cities, such as Frankfurt and Prague, where they had the resources to pay and support these people. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, Jews found that a less culturally advanced society allowed them to flourish. The chazanim of Eastern Europe created an improvisation with dramatic coloratura. They favored lyric tenors with a nasal quality, and the Eastern chazanim were considered the finest. They were more effective at reaching people than rabbis, at least as they are remembered today. The Eastern European chazanut has been accused a bit throughout history of being innately melancholy, largely due, I think, not to its nature, but to an analysis of this music through a Western lens, not through a Jewish one. And this is because a lot of this music uses the minor scale, although throughout Jewish history and Jewish musical history, there is no relation between minor and sadness. And in fact, it was that minor was just, in a lot of ways, felt to be a much more profound expression of emotion, and in general, that music is the offspring of profound emotion. For genuine music is the tonal expression of the life and struggle of a people. So, this is a pretty important point, and something that extends beyond this recital and beyond this lecture. And I think one thing that I really want people to take away is that oftentimes when we look at non-Western music, we still analyze it as if it were Western music, and we try to consider it and its value and its development within that lens, which really isn't fair and certainly isn't accurate. But Jewish music, while pretty unique in a lot of ways, is ultimately deeply connected to Western music, and we really start to see that as we have the harmony and polyphony in the synagogue. This started with Salomone Rossi, who was supported by the Dukes of Mantua, and he aimed to glorify and beautify the songs of King David according to the rules of music. His collection, Hasharim Asher li Shlomo, the Songs of Solomon, or rather, musical settings of the Songs of Solomon. We heard one example, the Hashkivenu prayer, earlier in this recital, was a chief example of his goal, and was in fact the first notated Jewish music, which makes it particularly important in our history. While this music was sung in Italian synagogues, it really wasn't obviously Jewish in any way. It sounded a lot like the rest of Renaissance polyphony, and maybe resultingly it vanished relatively quickly after his death. However, this point with polyphony is something that the German Jews started to latch on to quite significantly, and we saw an introduction of choral and instrumental music, not formally, but informally, starting in this period onwards. On the other hand, music of the Ashkenazi synagogue in the 17th to 18th century really saw a reintroduction of music and instrumental music, that is, and an expansion of the choir, likely related to Rossi and the other polyphonists. The Kabbalistic movement tried to lead the use of instrumental music in Friday evening services to bring in Shabbat with joy. And beginning in the 18th century, the use of the kahal, or community singers, usually a bass and a male soprano, became much more commonplace. The chazanim drew from secular tunes and created new tunes every week. They were still at this point quite minstrel-like, and they devoted themselves to music and considered all other community functions to be burdens, which ultimately led to complaints from the public as they did things such as changing and lengthening services to exemplify their music, and complaints from rabbis started to flow in as they began to use Christian music for their inspiration. We also have a pretty key point where at this period, chazanut, or cantor repertoire, became so much more musically complex that really only the chazanim could sing it, and largely the lay people couldn't understand it, and lay leaders couldn't exist anymore. Unfortunately, there were no recording devices at the time of the 17th and 18th centuries, so we have to settle for what we have now, which stretches back about 100 years in terms of recordings, and gives us some glimpse into what the music might have sounded like, because Eastern European chazanut didn't develop so differently, unlike German music, and we still can have a bit of an understanding of what it might have been. So although this recording is from an early 20th century documentary of Cantor Moshe Oisher and in a piece of Yiddish theater, it exemplifies the melismatic improvisational singing that we've been discussing. In this clip, the famous and wonderful, one of my favorite cantors, sings Hineni, a prayer recited by the cantor prior to the Musaf service of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, in which the cantor converses with God to accept their prayers on behalf of the community despite their failings. Wasn't that a beautiful, beautiful setting of Hineni? And in my opinion, Moshe Oishra is one of the most beautiful voices that we hear throughout the history of the cantors. Somewhat unusual, he was a baritone, but there were quite a few baritones. They just didn't often reach the fame that the tenors did. So next we see a dramatic shift in Ashkenazi Jewish music that came with the Reform movement in Germany. In the 19th century, people began to reform the synagogue ritual and music, particularly in Germany as a part of a larger move to join secular society. Israel Jakobson was the first major reformer. He introduced German hymns, language, church gowns, the organ, he removed the chazan, and he read Torah without chant. And in 1845, there was a resolution that the organ should be employed in services and recommended playing instruments at home on Sabbaths and holidays. While instruments were occasionally used prior to this time, a bit beginning with the 16th century polyphony, this resolution was the first official step towards the reintroduction of instruments, and not throughout all of Judaism, but at least in Reform Judaism. And this was pretty pivotal since we hadn't seen instruments in services, at least formally, since the destruction of the temple. This reform of synagogue music was largely driven by a craving for assimilation that roused a dislike for the traditional music of the synagogue. Solomon Sulzer and other reformers felt that Jewish liturgy must satisfy the musical demands while remaining Jewish. Chazanim were discouraged from improvising, and it was said that all music should be fixed and notated. Sulzer greatly advanced the art of Jewish choral music and restored dignity to the position of the chazan, which he from henceforward said should be called the cantor, as he called himself, and that's where we hear the origin of that word as opposed to chazan. Now we get to one of the first composers whose music is still commonly heard in Reformed synagogues today. Louis Lewandowski was responsible for synthesizing the old and the new. He tastefully and skillfully reshaped traditional material into modern forms, compiled in his Kol Rina Utefillah. He used the minor and the Ahava Rabbah modes in his compositions to express a sweet lyric strain inspiring hope and life, as was traditional. He understood the importance of chant, and he created a recitative based on the traditional Jewish modes for the entire year of ritual. His book created a class of what were called the second grade chazanim, or the Kol Rina cantors. While the Reform movement dominated Jewish musical changes in Germany, Eastern European Jews continued on in a much more traditional path. Many of the significant chazanim and composers worked throughout the 19th century, creating remarkable music in the traditional style, without the burdens of the reforms in Germany. Towards the end of the century, pogroms, unfortunately, largely drove Jews out of the region and stifled the creativity of those who remained. Some chazanim immigrated to America and helped to establish the unique music of the American Jews, particularly with Yiddish theater. Thus, at the end of the 19th century, we see Ashkenazi Jewish music grappling with reform and assimilation in Germany while being driven out of Eastern Europe. Perhaps as a result of all these changes, Jewish music developed in a lot of different ways in the 19th and 20th centuries, so I think at this point forward, the best way to understand the music is to break it up into its different paths. Starting with the sound of the Eastern European synagogue, I'm going to present an example of a setting of music that may have been heard at this time, probably not exactly, but it gives a general sense of it. That'll be done with Modim, set by Jacob Rappaport.
Although there are several schools of Ashkenazi cantorial music, specifically Western, Central, and Eastern, what they all have in common is that they sang an individual prayer on one agreed-upon mode. And this mode is meant to give interpretation and a certain feeling to the prayer being sung. And then also, at the end of the prayer, there was some repeating motif that identified what prayer was being sung. And then, of course, there were some internal motifs that were turned. So generally, the prayer developed to be chanted in some recognizable way, with internal motifs being customized to the specific words being sung. And then at the end, some closing motif that was recognizable and identifiable as being a part of that specific prayer. Now, this is what happens in the synagogue, but many of these prayers and chants that occurred during actual prayer, which is largely improvisational, in the synagogue itself, they became crystallized into specific repertoire pieces as a cantor began to sing and improvise more and more on a prayer. He began to settle on some sort of accepted way that he would sing that prayer, and then we know this now as his quote-unquote piece for that specific prayer. Although, if you listen to several of the recordings, there is still some more minor improvisation that occurs. If you listen to more than one recording of a given cantor singing his composition. But through the years, some sort of performance tradition has developed for each of these pieces of repertoire, and they are performed according to that performance tradition.
So what Cantor Yoni Rose just presented about was how these original modes and melodies and motifs started to become developed into pieces and into music that was not just heard in services, but was also heard outside of these services in concert halls and at celebrations and many other places. And these pieces are largely what we have and what we our window into music at this time, at least cantorial music. So I want to take a brief step back to the 19th and 20th centuries to hear a late product of the development of Eastern European chazanut. Imagine yourself walking into a synagogue in Poland or somewhere else in Eastern Europe. And Jews are in the middle of davening, that is praying the Amidah, the central set of prayers of every service. The chazan is improvising based on the appropriate nusach, mode, and he begins to sing his typical melody for modim. Today, most chazanut has disappeared from services and is only rarely performed on recitals, such as this one. However, there are a few cases of it that still exist, mostly pieces based on Sinai melodies or prayers for the high holidays. This is the persisting chazanut, as I've called it. Kol Nidre is a perfect example, and I'm going to present one that has been set by Sholom Secunda and arranged by myself for voice and piano. Before I sing it, though, I want to give a little bit of background on the Kol Nidre. It's a prime example of a Sinai melody that's been recited probably since the 11th century. The Kol Nidre, meaning all vows, is sung traditionally 3 times in direct succession in the evening service that starts Yom Kippur, starting in a low and soft voice and increasing in volume with each repetition. While the prayer is known for its solemnity, it is fundamentally a legal contract that was used to break certain vows people may have made in the past year. At the time of its introduction, Jews were being forced to convert to Christianity or Islam upon pain of death. So it's possible it was introduced to enable these forced converts to return to and pray within the Jewish community. However, though, as a result, it's also wrapped up in a long history of controversy within Judaism and a justification for anti-Semitism by non-Jews who felt the Jews used it to break their promises. Nonetheless, though, Kol Nidre remains one of the best examples of Jewish liturgy, and its melody has been a source of inspiration for many composers, both composing vocal settings of it or instrumental settings. On the other hand, there's a great deal of repertoire that was sung, and in some cases is still sung, that flowed out of the German Jewish music tradition. Music that was written during the 19th century Reform, such as music by Lewandowski, is commonly heard in synagogues to this day. So I'm going to present some of this music that I've included as the music of the German Jews in 19th century Reform, and give an example through Uvnachol Yomar, set by Louis Lewandowski, arranged by myself after the great cantor Naftali Hershtik. Lewandowski composed at least 6 different settings of the prayer Uvnachol Yomar, which is sung as the Torah is returned to the Ark. These settings can be found in his influential collections, the Kol Rina U'Tefillah and the Shabbat Torah Ve'Simra. Cantor Naftali Hershtik famously synthesized several of these different settings for cantor, choir, and organ, and in this case I've rearranged it for just voice and piano, or if you imagine it, cantor and piano. Lewandowski's music is quite representative of the peak of German Chazanut. Although Hershtik's slight embellishments and use of falsetto really combine some of the elements of the Eastern European style, it's fundamentally much more in line with German music. Jewish music also influenced the development of classical music, particularly in its influence on classical composers of Jewish heritage. I'm going to present the Kaddish from Deux Mélodies Hébraïques by Maurice Ravel. So there were a lot of classical composers of Jewish descent, such as Meyerbeer, Halevi, Mendelssohn, Offenbach, Mahler, Schoenberg, Bloch, Gershwin, Korngold, Bernstein, Reich, and many others. The majority had pretty limited exposure to a strongly Jewish environment, and in fact, quite a few of them converted Christianity, possibly to boost their success in their careers, since it was a lot more popular to be Christian. Unfortunate a bit for us, since the music was thus largely not particularly Jewish in nature, although really all music created by Jews is Jewish music. But back to this, most Jewish musicians created European music as a result of the society that they were raised in. Some of these composers did make occasional use of very clearly Jewish themes in their music. This could be heard in a lot of Bloch's works, such as the Israel Symphony and the Baal Shem Suite, in Schoenberg's Kol Nidre, Mahler's First Symphony, the Third Movement, Bernstein's Kaddish Symphony, and Reich's Tehillim. For a bit of background about the Kaddish itself, it's an extremely important prayer that joins the community together to magnify and sanctify God's name. Beginning in the 11th century, it served notably as the mourner's Kaddish, which uses the Kaddish text with an addendum, although it's never sung in this instance. Generally, in the case of the Chatzi Kaddish, it's chanted to mark the conclusion of a section or service and serve as a transition of sorts. Due to the significance of the text, Chazanim prolonged the singing of the Kaddish, or the Chatzi Kaddish, to give people time for introspection and meditation. And now, although Maurice Ravel's Jewish heritage is a bit cloudy, he was largely influenced in this case by Eastern European Chazanut, and he set both the Kaddish and a Yiddish piece, The Eternal Enigma, in 1914, perhaps as a response to World War I. With that, I will sing the Kaddish.
Shemay
while we had Western composers who were maybe of Jewish descent composing Western music with some influence from Jewish music, there was also Jewish art music, which was predominantly Jewish music, much more equally synthesized with Western classical music. As an example of this, I'll present Yosel Klezmer by the prolific composer Lazar Weiner. Jewish art song at its base is a synthesis of Western art music and Yiddish, Hebrew folk song and poetry. The Society for Jewish Folk Music, Gesellschaft für Jiddische Volksmusik, founded in St. Petersburg in 1908 to collect and preserve Jewish folk music, advocated for the creation of this uniquely Jewish art music. The poetry that was used ranged from topics such as shtetl life and the experience of Jewish immigrants to existential musings about humanity. Some of the most noted composers of this were Lazar Weiner, Moses Milner, Maurice Rauch, Sholem Sekunda, Max Helfman, and Yehudi Weiner, Lazar Weiner's son. And this group and a few others elevated the genre to the level of other art song. As I mentioned before, Lazar Weiner was really the most prolific and the most influential composer of Yiddish art song. He sought to create a pure, authentic melodic style that harkened back to elements of Jewish music such as synagogue chant, Hasidic songs and dances, biblical cantillation. He used the piano to serve the melodic line and text, not as an accompaniment, but as an independent yet inseparable musical setting. His music never used quotation. His son quoted him as saying, "If I need a traditional melody, I create my own." Yosel Klezmer is particularly derived from structurally and musically klezmer music, or wedding band music, but it uses an elaborate and energetic piano part to elevate this folk-inspired melody to an art song.
Yosel Klezmer spielt auf was Simcha, ganz clever.
Composers today are still actively creating Jewish music, as I'm sure you're all aware, and this is both for the synagogue and for the concert hall. Cantor Yoni Rose will present a bit about the basic development of new music for the synagogue, and then I'll present a musical example through Ashrei Hagafur from A Kindling Flame by Samuel Rosner.
Jewish synagogue and religious music traditions have always been influenced by musical trends surrounding them. So, when Jews come to Israel, or they came to America in the early 20th century, they were also influenced by the society around them. And just as the general society began to move away from classical music in the 1950s and 60s, so too Jewish music. There was a very large Jewish music revolution heralded by Reb Shlomo Carlebach, who was a very famous rabbi and cantor and Jewish musician in the 60s and 70s, who brought the concept of Jewish folk music into the synagogue. And Jewish synagogue music became less about listening and praying along silently to oneself as the cantor expressed the congregation's feelings for everyone else. And now there was a desire to express everyone's feelings for themselves, and therefore the music had to reflect what the congregation itself wanted to sing. So the changes in synagogue music towards more folk music and popular music sounding melodies has also gone hand in hand with the way people daven, the Yiddish word for pray, in the synagogue, and that they want to sing along with the cantor as opposed to listening along to the cantor. I remember being told anecdotes from people about growing up in synagogues in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and how whenever the congregation began to hum or sing along with the cantor would immediately change what he was doing so that no one could sing along, because they considered it anathema to have participation in the synagogue. The cantor was supposed to represent the community, and the community was and other synagogue goers were supposed to rely on the cantor to represent their feelings to God. This has changed, of course, since the second half of the 20th century, and people want to sing along and express themselves what it is that they want to say. Therefore, services are structured very differently now than they would have been 50 years ago, in that where it would have been the cantor would engage in long improvisations based on prayers, and this was pretty standard throughout the world. Now synagogue prayers can sound, maybe the music is at its core similar throughout the world, but the way that it's presented, the prayers which are emphasized, the whether or not there is any improvisation occurring during a prayer, whether the amount of congregational singing that goes on, and the ratios between the two changes based on the specific synagogue within whatever geographical region, and then also differs based on geographical regions. The way that synagogue music will sound in modern day, say, Frankfurt, Germany, will sound, it's of the same cloth as music sung, for instance, in Baltimore, Maryland, in a synagogue on a weekly basis. However, in Frankfurt, Germany, we may sing several improvisational passages and also some congregational music. But in Baltimore, it would generally be much more emphasis on congregational music.
Thanks again, Yoni. So, I want to present an example of racially written Jewish music. And although it's being written both for services, it's also being written for the concert hall, in this case, which is exemplified by Samuel Rausner's set of 3 pieces of Hebrew art song with poetry by the Jewish paratrooper Chana Senesh. Samuel Rausner is a student and composed these pieces a few years ago, which is extremely impressive given how beautiful I think that they are, and I hope that you think so too. So, for our last example and our last segment, although Jewish music has continued past this, I want to end with this focus on Jewish music and its how it developed in the popular world, probably most exemplified by Yiddish theater. I'll present Bei mir bist du schön, written by Sholem Sekunda, and let's dig into it a little bit. So, Jewish music meets Broadway. During the 19th century reform, Yiddish plays began to be read and performed for entertainment. These often dealt with themes such as generational conflict between the Old World immigrants and their American-born children, or conflict between Hasidic and Reformed Jews. The first Yiddish theater troupe arrived in the U.S. in 1882 and started an extremely popular and successful enterprise. At its height, Yiddish theater was selling hundreds of thousands of tickets throughout the year. And Yiddish theater was known for its satirical, quick-witted comedy, its fiery temperament, and over-the-top drama, the music, that is the singing, both klezmer and cantorial. And there's quite a few examples of it that were based on famous plays, such as Shakespeare's Hamlet became the Yeshiva Bocher, the Yeshiva student, and they gave Hamish or homey endings so that the Jews could enjoy the high society while still retaining their traditional Jewish values. Bei mir bist du schön was originally a part of Sholem Sekunda's 1932 musical comedy Man kann leben, nur man lässt nicht. One could really live, but they won't let you. Seeing pretty minimal initial success, Sekunda sold the rights, and English adaptation was created that became world famous, despite losing its Yiddish charm. It was recorded by Ella Fitzgerald, the Andrews sisters, the Berry sisters, Judy Garland, Benny Goodman, and many others. What I found particularly funny when looking into the history of this piece was that in 1938, the song was received enthusiastically on German radio broadcasts until it was later discovered that it actually was in Yiddish, not a southern German dialect. So, I want to present Bei mir bist du schön as my final piece, and I want to thank you all for coming.
So sein Schatz wie ein Toter, erst beugen wie bei einer Quote, und die hinkt sie bisslich, das Herz an der Fischlach, so recht du sollst mich nicht, und die Osternarischen schmecken, und die Ostwaldule sechen, bis wild wie an die Jahre, bis auf viele Galatiane, such ich, du sollst mich nicht, such mir die Kirche schon gebaut.
coming to my lecture recital. Although it ended up being virtual, I would love to be able to present another program for you in person, perhaps on another subject or on an offshoot of one of the ones today. This recital took quite a bit of preparation and quite a bit of research in order to get this full history together, and I hope that I did my best in presenting it concisely and presenting it as it should be, an authentic and as accurate as I possibly can. And in order to do that, I referenced quite a few sources, which you can see here. If you are interested in learning more, I highly recommend many of these as wonderful ways in which to learn about our rich history of the music that we sing in services and we hear throughout the year. Thank you again.